What? You thought just because the show ended that meant I was done reviewing Pony forever? When Jeff Gordon hung up his fire suit and helmet 4 years ago, that didn't stop me from continuing to watch and talk about NASCAR. Even if the last few NASCAR seasons have been, well, terrible. Nonetheless, even with Friendship is Magic literally closing the book with its final chapter on October 12th, there are still quite a lot of videos I want to make about the show, namely Season 9 episodes to review. But before I tackle more recent episodes, I wanted to take the opportunity to go back to the past and review an episode from one of my favorite seasons, that being Season 4. Now, there were only 2 Nightmare Night episodes from the entirety of the show, those coming in Seasons 2 and 5, so the episode I want to talk about today isn't actually a Halloween episode per se, but thanks to its memorable moments taking place at night and its creepy imagery, this one has been on my review radar for some time. So, kick back with your favorite candy, turn down the lights, and enjoy my take on bats. Okay, so I can probably predict what most bronies think when this episode crosses their minds. Fluttershy turns into Flutterbat and that's about it, right? Well, true, Bats has a very memorable sequence at the end where our beloved Fluttershy transforms into Flutterbat. On the surface, this can sound bad since Flutterbat only comes into play in the last third of the episode, yet this isn't always the case since a lot of movies have memorable sequences that stand out as well, but the rest of the movie is still good. Just like Empire Strikes Back has that famous Darth Vader father twist at the end. That's the scene that pops into people's minds right away, yet the film still has amazing character growth and world building that leads up to that iconic scene. Bats is very similar in this case with how the episode slowly builds up the conflict between Applejack going to the extreme to save her orchard, and Fluttershy having to choose whether or not to help her friend due to her kindness and animal-loving nature. Both the conflict and the premise of this episode are honestly rather simple in nature, yet how the episode handles Applejack's stubbornness when it came to her metaphorically butting heads with Fluttershy is the deciding factor in what made the story work. Being stubborn is one of the flaws I adore in Applejack's character, but I also understand how easy it can be to make a hard-headed character unlikable if their stubbornness is taken too far, or they're not justified for why they refuse to see another character's point of view. And when you pit Applejack against a sweet, sympathetic, and adorable mare like Fluttershy, the writers getting her right is of the utmost importance. And boy did they ever nail it. The episode actually goes above and beyond, giving Applejack numerous reasonable explanations for her hateful attitude towards the vampire fruit bats. Of course, the easy one is given right away as the episode starts. The bats are a major threat to her family's livelihood and a source of food for Ponyville. Now, while the story could have just ended it right there, as someone's livelihood being at risk is an understandable motivation for their mindset and actions, I love how we're given more and more reasons to come to an understanding of Applejack's point of ridding her orchard of the vampire fruit bats as the episode goes on.
I'll be darned if they think they're gonna sink their fangs into my blue ribbon apple.
On top of that, this revelation that AJ and her family have been growing a massive apple for the Appaloosa State Fair produce competition is another good reason to understand where her attitude is coming from. Discounting the hard work that had to go into growing an apple that impressive, if the vampire fruit bats get a hold of it, then that could be extra income from winning the competition that would be lost to the apples. And even if they didn't win, or there is no prize money to be won, the loss of the apple could still cost them new customers, or good word of mouth from ponies who could have seen it at the fair and become interested in buying their apples from towns outside of Ponyville, which would in turn bring them more income. Think that's the final catalyst given to explain Applejack's refusal to listen to Fluttershy? Actually, it's not. The final reason given to make AJ's side more understandable is rather subtle and is very much a blink and you miss it moment. However, do you remember that short flashback we get when AJ narrates what happened the last time vampire fruit bats swarmed Sweet Apple Acres? In it, we see how bad the devastation was and how much the Apple family had to ration and stretch that particular crop for themselves in Ponyville. Well, notice how AJ nor even Big Mac is present. In fact, Granny Smith is shown to be around what I can guess is Applejack's current age for Season 4. Without saying anything beyond how bad the orchard was hit, the episode shows us that not only have the vampire fruit bats not been a problem for quite a long time, but that Applejack herself has never in actuality had to deal with vampire fruit bats in her entire life. This tells us that Applejack's lack of experience and fear that was built up from Granny Smith's experience is fueling her decisions to both ignore Fluttershy's point of view and to stamp out the bats without any regard.
But Granny Smith has told me enough stories about it that just the thought of it gives me nightmares.
Because she's never dealt with a situation like this before, Applejack is going purely off what she thinks is best for her family's orchard or gut instinct. This is the episode showing us what can happen when a lack of experience in something can drive people to make decisions they think is best without considering any other options to complete a task or solve a problem. Just like how Fluttershy points out that sacrificing a small section of Sweet Apple Acres for the vampire fruit bats is a short-term loss but a long-term gain. Over time, the bats can help expand the amount of trees for the orchard and thus make crops and harvests even bigger for the apple family. Unfortunately, the horrific thought of a devastating crop loss akin to what Granny Smith had to go through blocks off AJ's mind from listening to her friend. And speaking of Fluttershy again, I really appreciate that the writers didn't simply stick her with just one argument for her side of the disagreement. That being that the vampire fruit bats are simply there because they're hungry and that they're doing what other animals and even ponies do by trying to feed their families. Just like with Applejack's worry about her orchard being at stake, while this is also understandable, it's good that they added how the vampire fruit bats can be helpful instead of simply being a nuisance to AJ and her family. It honestly would have felt shallow if her argument only boiled down to, oh, but the cute little animals, which on one hand I can see because I'm a massive dog lover, yet having her point out a more objective reason to not simply stomp out the bats, but to work with them by sacrificing a small number of trees because they spit out the apple seeds absolutely made her argument more compelling. And even though Applejack is my favorite pony, going this route with Fluttershy made me side with her over AJ. It's sort of like the mantra for business owners. In order to make money, you have to spend money. In other words, it's a short-term loss giving up a small piece of the orchard to the vampire fruit bats, but in the long run, the seeds they spit out can grow into countless more apple trees that the apple family can use to have bigger harvests. Now, that's not to say Applejack's reasons were weak or lazy by any means. I mean, she was losing trees as she and Fluttershy spoke. But the writers at least did a great job making the audience sympathize with her and understand just where AJ is coming from without making her unlikable. In fact, listen to AJ when Fluttershy offers to speak to the vampire fruit bats on her behalf.
Oh, I'm sure if we just let them know how special that particular apple is to you, they'll leave it alone.
Yeah, right. Be my guest.
Even though she said it in an unconvinced tone, Applejack still allowed Fluttershy to utilize her special talent to reach an understanding with the vampire fruit bats before she goes gung-ho about getting rid of them by any means. Now, other than the Flutterbat sequence, which I'll get into in a little bit, another memorable part of Bats has got to be Applejack and Fluttershy's song. Just wow. Daniel Ingram's songwriting talents and the animator's visuals worked incredibly well in conjunction with each other and really knocked this part of the episode out of the park. Other than how well written both AJ and Fluttershy are for holding their opposing views, their song helped add an entertainment factor to the episode and kind of prepared us for the final act. What do I mean by this? Well, obviously, the utilization of deep and low-pitched instruments helps create an ominous and foreboding sound to help create an unsettling feeling that sells how Applejack feels about the destruction of her trees. Yet at the same time, it manages to have this catchy beat that also makes it somewhat of a fun song on top of the more uncomfortable aspect that at least AJ's part of the song is trying to convey. However, the visuals are absolutely brilliant, and I have to applaud the animators for how much effort went into this darker sequence. Take note of when the song begins and the dozens of vampire fruit bats leap off a tree, all of the bright, vibrant cheerfulness disappears, only to be replaced by a paler color palette that represents the loss of hope, joy, and life to the trees that the vampire fruit bats have stripped away. On the other hand, I also adore how the animators use the visuals to their advantage and show us just how differently AJ and Fluttershy see the bats. Applejack sees red-eyed monsters that take and take, while Fluttershy just sees adorable creatures that are loving parents to their babies. And that's not even the best part. What's really clever about this whole song is that we're shown just how many trees have been stripped down to almost nothing while the characters are singing, yet the now bare trees actually stay in the background of the orchard even after the song concludes. Sure, they could have just been used solely for the song itself to add a creepier element of dead-looking trees to emphasize the doom and gloom AJ is preaching, but keeping the stripped-down trees for the remainder of the episode not only helps the atmosphere of the nighttime scene later on, but helps AJ's case by showing how quickly the vampire fruit bats are working, so the trees themselves sort of become a ticking clock element. Honestly, with the ominous beat of the song, the creepy visuals with AJ's depiction of the bats juxtaposed with Fluttershy's more innocent depiction of the bats, and the paler colors all combined with Daniel Ingram's lyrics makes this song not only fun and engaging, but a brilliantly written sequence that has elements which stick around for the entirety of the episode. In addition to the song, there was some good humor thrown in before Twilight executed her plan of using a spell to strip away the vampire fruit bat's desire to stop sucking the apples into husks. Seems like she perfected that spell she attempted to use on the Parasprites in Swarm of the Century, huh? Pinkie bouncing around happily with a head full of apples to draw the bats to one tree was a little amusing. But Rarity wearing a full-sized hazmat suit and freaking out when a vampire fruit bat starts slurping up a busted apple from the front of her helmet was easily the funniest part of the episode. And although the other methods of rounding up the bats weren't as funny, like Rainbow zooming about the orchard or Fluttershy and Twilight simply setting buckets of apples in the tree, at least the animators had 4 different methods to show us, so this short sequence didn't become repetitive. And with Fluttershy using her stare as part of Twilight's plan though, it's important to note that no pony actually forced her to do so despite being hit with the moral dilemma of Twilight's idea to use the spell. Even though Fluttershy is clearly against it, listen to how AJ phrases her question once she has been given time to think about it.
So what's it gonna be, Fluttershy? Will you do your stare on the bats or not?
This tells us Fluttershy is not being forced to do this by AJ or any of her other friends for that matter. They've all given her a choice to make on her own, which unfortunately she gives into because she's afraid of letting them down, especially since Twilight added how all of Ponyville could also be affected by an apple crop shortage. So it's not like Applejack is being unreasonable with Fluttershy, which the writers could have easily done, and I'm glad they didn't because that would have pushed AJ too far. As for Flutterbat herself, I have to applaud the writers yet again for how well paced the build-up is and just how much foreshadowing is injected into the story before the big reveal. Take the scene with Twilight's spell for example. We see the lavender light of her magic reflecting on half of Fluttershy's face while she's doing her stare, and she continues her stare well past Twilight ceases performing the spell, hinting that something else must have happened. We're then treated to Fluttershy giving a few sniffs of the air before looking back at a forgotten apple upon the ground. Not to mention that during this scene, take note of the background and look at just how many more trees that have been robbed of apples thanks to the bats, which really helps show that the girls executed the plan just in time. Or so they think. Anyway, the next bit of foreshadowing presented to us is the next day when AJ finds out that she still has apples that are being sucked dry. Just listen to how Twilight's dialogue here is written when they all find out that the spell actually did work on the bats.
But if the vampire bats aren't eating your apples, who is? Fluttershy, you're our animal expert.
Notice how she answers her own question by saying Fluttershy's name immediately after asking it. Of course, the foreshadowing becomes a lot more obvious later on, like with Fluttershy drooling at a tree and Pinkie finding her sniffing an apple, but I love the subtlety of these two that I've already discussed. And then, things get even better. I love the beginning of the Flutterbat transformation because of how slowly and creepily the camera zooms in on Fluttershy as her eyes gradually change to red and a fang pops out of her teeth before the scene changes. Then of course, just as everyone remembers it, the Flutterbat sequence is absolutely glorious. The bare trees look even creepier with a darker purplish nighttime backdrop, making the orchard appear dead and as if it's reaching out to grab our beloved little ponies. The use of Flutterbat moving quickly as a silhouette and shadow builds up to just what kind of monster Fluttershy has become, and is used almost like the Jaws effect where we get glimpses of her, only allowing our minds to fill in what the hell she's become. Heck, even the mist on the ground is used wonderfully when Rainbow mistakes a scarecrow for the culprit. And then, we get the big reveal.
Something you don't see every day.
My god, when Flutterbat is discovered, it's both a mixture of horror with her literally becoming a vampire pony and a mix of comedy by how Pinkie freaks out and believes Flutterbat will eat them, and how even Rainbow Dash is freaked out by her. Not to mention Rarity unironically asking Fluttershy to stop being a vampire pony. However, despite how well executed the sequence with Flutterbat is with its comedy, creepy visuals, and horror fake-outs, my favorite part of it is honestly Applejack. Even with all this devastation to her family's orchard thanks to both the vampire fruit bats and now Flutterbat, this line where AJ says remorsefully,
If she keeps this up, your whole crop will be gone in no time.
That's the least of my worries. I just want my friend back.
is the final piece to show how this episode clearly understands how to make a stubborn character work to perfection. This is an absolutely excellent way to have a stubborn character admit their fault without plainly spelling it out to the audience. Applejack sees the horrifying consequences of ignoring her friend's protests and how they've befallen upon Fluttershy and is now going to work hard at getting her friend back. It's a fantastic lesson to show how doing something the quick and easy way can come back to bite you in the ass down the road. And by having Applejack not only admit that by tossing aside her pride for the orchard, but sacrificing her giant apple just to have a chance to get her friend back from something she caused is a wonderful way for a stubborn character to realize and atone for not listening to their friend's advice. Not to mention, it's a hell of a lot better than if her friends had to tell her to sacrifice her apple and AJ had to be talked into doing it. Her actions of using one of the reasons to stomp out the bats earlier in the episode as bait to get her friend back more than proves her acknowledgement that she was in the wrong and is actively trying to right it for the sake of her friend. As for the ending with AJ and Fluttershy's friendship journal entries, well, I like them. I mean, I don't really know how it could be criticized, to be perfectly honest. I did like that Fluttershy also learned that you have to say no, even to your closest friends, when you're aware that what they're asking of you to do is wrong. Though I do have to say it's good that AJ's lesson was written down first, since her short-sightedness is what set the events of Flutterbat in motion since she refused to listen to Fluttershy in the first place, and the episode knew this. It's a good lesson to learn that the quick and easiest decisions to fix a problem aren't always a good idea and can lead to more problems in the future if it's not well thought out. Just remember though that Fluttershy had the opportunity to say no to her friends but was too afraid of disappointing them, and she learned that she needs to stand strong with her beliefs, even if it's against close friends like the main five. However, I do love that ending shot where it reveals that perhaps not all of Flutterbat was driven from her completely. And that was Bats. That was actually a lot to unpack. This episode truly has a lot more to offer than just the final act with Flutterbat. Fantastic animation and visuals, a catchy yet unsettling song, a good lesson about the dangers of getting rid of a problem quickly without giving fair consideration to other ideas, and a story that brilliantly shows how to write in a stubborn character that makes them understandable and brings them around to realize that they were in the wrong. Bats more than deserves its green flag rating and was much more fun to sit through than I remembered. But now I'm curious, how do you guys feel about Bats? Do you think it has a lot more to offer than just Flutterbat as well? Let me know down below, and thanks for watching. I'm MrLeftTurn. I'll see you when I get back from the track.